Changing a country isn't easy, but change is inevitable. And the choices we make today will shape our country for generations to come. That's why we've published our first book from Australia Institute Press. What's the Big Idea offers 32 ideas for a better Australia, from leading thinkers such as Bob Brown, Sally McManus, Dr. Emma Shortis, and Professor Brian Schmidt. The essays are a roadmap and a reminder that the solutions exist. Australia just needs the courage to implement them. Visit australiainstitute.org.au or follow the link in the show notes to order your copy of What's the Big Idea today.
Hello and welcome to Dollars and Cents, the Australian Institute podcast where we're talking about just what the hell is going on in the economy. I'm Elinor Johnston-Leek, the senior content producer here at the Australian Institute, and our chief economist Greg Jericho is away this week. If you've been following his Blue Sky, you'll know that he lost a fight with the pavement coming off his bike. But best wishes to him. He seems to be recovering at home pretty well. But filling in for him today is our senior economist, Matt Grudnoff. Thanks so much for coming on today, Matt.
Thanks for having me and replacing Greg.
Yeah, well, look, hopefully not permanently.
No, not permanently.
No. So, Matt, I want to talk to you today about a report that you've written about wealth inequality in Australia. Wealth inequality is increasing in Australia. So, the divide between those who have the most and those who have the least is growing. So is this a significant increase?
Yeah, so what we did is we looked at 20 years of data. So we weren't interested in what happens from year to year because that can jump around.
Yeah.
What we looked at is how much has Australians' wealth increased from 2002 to 2022. So over a 20-year period, how much has it increased? And more importantly, what kind of assets have most increased? So your wealth is made up of lots of different stuff. Obviously, the two biggest assets, I should say, is the family home, if you have one. So we're talking on average here. Not everybody has a family home, but on average, Australian households' biggest asset is the family home, and the second biggest is their super.
Okay.
And then, there's lots of other assets. You've got money in your bank, in bank accounts. You've got, your car, you've got your belongings, you've got all sorts of other bits and pieces. But those are the two big assets. And there's also a third large asset that is becoming increasingly important, and that is other property. And that mostly means investment properties. So we're talking about property that people own that is not their family home.
Okay. But just to be clear for those of us who aren't economists, when we're talking about wealth, we're not talking about what people are making in their paycheck, are we?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So your income flows into your wealth if you don't spend it all.
Yeah.
So, you get paid, and if you buy assets with it or you save it up, that becomes part of your wealth. So high income earners quite often are wealthy, but not always
not
so.
Necessarily.
Right? Not necessarily.
Not if they're spending it all on Lambos.
Right. And low income earners can sometimes be wealthy, right? So if you're a retired person, you might just be on an age pension, but you might own an enormous house in a lovely suburb, and so therefore you're quite wealthy. But usually high-income earners are also wealthy.
Yeah.
Housing affordability in Australia has reached a record low as mortgage rates and high home prices drive buyers out of the market.
It almost feels like a cliche to say that it's never been worse, but truly it's never been worse.
Every day that we don't solve the housing crisis, I feel like I've let them down a little bit, absolutely, because that's the point of politics, and I feel it every day. I come from a generation of people in my generation who for the first time are probably going to be worse off than our parents.
So what's sort of driving this increase in wealth inequality in Australia? What's making people acquire so much wealth?
Yeah, so the big change that we've seen in recent years is this other property, investment properties.
Yeah.
So as a general rule, home ownership has actually reduced wealth inequality in Australia traditionally.
Yeah.
And that's because we've had very high home ownership rates.
So when you say traditionally, up until sort of when are we speaking?
Yeah, so we're talking about post-World War II. There was this massive increase through the 50s and 60s in home ownership. And then home ownership, because it was the largest asset most people owned and because most people owned their own home, it actually made Australia more equal. There were always people who didn't have a home and that made them particularly poor. But in recent years, over the past sort of 20 or 30 years, home ownership rates have been going down. And as they've been going down, that's been making wealth less equally distributed because more and more households don't have that big asset. And so therefore they're dropping down and fewer people are owning their own property.
But the amount of properties isn't decreasing. The amount of properties is increasing. So,
Exactly right. So how can this be happening?
Yeah.
Well, this is where it comes into investment properties. So those houses, when home ownership rates go down, it doesn't mean that those houses are just vanishing. What's happening is people who already own their own home, right, are buying those houses as investment properties. And what that means is that wealth is being more and more concentrated into fewer and fewer hands. Housing is being more and more concentrated into the hands of fewer and fewer people. And that's coming out in the data. What we're seeing is the most wealthy are seeing this massive increase in one particular category, and that's other property, those investment properties.
So what's changed to sort of drive this increase in people investing in property?
Yeah, so the big change seems to have occurred just after about 2000, so about 20 years ago, 25 years ago now. It's 2025, isn't it?
Yeah.
So about 25 years ago. And that's mainly because of two very large tax concessions. And in particular, the capital gains tax discount came in 1999. This was introduced by the Howard government, and it basically halved the amount of tax that you paid on capital gains. So if you buy an asset for $100 and you sell it for $200, you've made a $100 capital gain. And that's income, right? So that then goes onto your tax return and it becomes part of your income and you pay tax on that. But what the capital gains tax discount says is, let's pretend you didn't make a $100 capital gain. Let's pretend it was only half as much. It was only $50. So they basically halve the size of the capital gain. And so you only pay tax on half the capital gain.
Yeah. So that means that a bunch of people who could afford it would then looked at buying investment properties and went, this looks a lot more financially beneficial to me.
And then also it links really well with negative gearing, which means that you can write off any losses you make over time while you're holding that investment property. And these two have basically morphed together to drive people to think, well, actually investing in property, in residential property, is really what accountants call tax effective, right? It basically means that you make really good returns, but you also don't pay as much tax as you would on those returns if you invested in other things like shares or something like that. And so more and more Australians have been going, you know what, I'm going to invest in investment properties. But the problem with that is when they show up to the auction, there's a limited number of properties. So if more and more people want to buy investment properties, that means by definition, less and less people are buying those properties in order to live in them. And that's where we get the housing crisis. Effectively, what's happening is these cashed up investors who, are making these decisions usually later in life when they've got quite a lot of assets already. So they've got the money behind them and they're outbidding first home buyers and they're holding people out of being able to buy their own home. And so what we're seeing is increases in the number of rental properties, but decreases in the number of properties where people are living in them, the owner-occupiers.
For a very small percentage of the population, a very small percentage indeed, that they would make additional contributions. And it is a fairness measure to take into account that the superannuation system is very important, but it's very generous at the high end.
As the Prime Minister said, 17 people have got more than 100 million, one person's got more than 400 million. And think about this example. A $100 million fund earning a 5% return receives a tax break upwards of $1.5 million a year compared to a return outside of super if it was taxed at the marginal rate.
They're also making wealth inequality much worse in Australia. But is investment property sort of the biggest thing that's driving this? And is there anything else that's causing this problem?
Yeah, so investment properties are absolutely the worst. They're the most rapidly growing of all of the assets we've seen over the last 20 years. They're growing the fastest. But the other big assets are also making it worse. So if we look at superannuation, the second largest asset that the average home has, traditionally superannuation actually reduced wealth inequality. When the Labor Party first introduced it way back in the 1990s, the idea was that only people in really high income jobs actually got super.
Yep.
It was actually quite rare, and it was only really for well-to-do people.
Okay.
And they basically, what Keating wanted to do was introduce it to all Australians, that all Australians would have access to this. And so, when he did that, that basically effectively meant that it was more equally distributed. But then Howard came along.
Bloody Howard.
And he changed the laws, basically, and he made it so that you paid almost no tax. Like for a while there, superannuation was crazy. The sort of stuff you could get away with. You could stuff enormous amounts of money into your super account. Even today, you pay very little tax on your super. And so what rich people did was they thought, well, if I stuff all this money into my super, then I can use that as a way of avoiding paying tax. And so what they've done is they've stuffed lots of money into their super. And of course, average people and poor people can't stuff lots of money into their super.
Don't have lots of money to stuff.
And so super has turned into this thing that's making inequality worse. And we've seen that. We've seen that the superannuation tax concessions have grown rapidly. We've seen, in fact, to give you an example, so actually there is one super balance with over $400 million. $400 million.
$400 million.
Exactly right. And who needs that amount of money in order to retire? Is this about having a comfortable retirement? $400 million. There are lots of super funds out there with $100 million or more in them. And so, obviously these aren't about, having a nice retirement. This is about avoiding tax and passing on those assets to your next generation, to your heirs, without having to pay a whole heap of tax or it being a really complicated affair. And so superannuation has become this sort of vehicle for avoiding tax. And, to the Labor Party's credit and even the coalition government, they have made small changes. And we have another small change that's actually before the Parliament right now. And that's the idea of increasing the tax on superannuation balances above $3 million.
Yeah, we talked about that a couple episodes ago with Greg on the pod. And last I heard, nothing was really moving. There was no real appetite to change it.
Yeah, so there has been a bit of a shift in that. So Parliament's come back and the Labor Party are keen to try and pass this. We know that they're trying to negotiate with the crossbench at the moment. The coalition have said, no, they're definitely not passing this. This is outrageous. Apparently thinking that you should tax people with $3 million or more in their super, a little bit more, is outrageous. And so they're negotiating with the crossbench, and we may see, if we see a deal, it may actually pass before the election.
Okay, well, that's good. Good to hear. So, Matt, maybe this is too simplistic a question, but maybe it'd be good to get an economist's perspective on this. But why is wealth inequality bad?
Yeah, it's a great question. So why is it bad? Well, it's not just that it's unfair, it's actually bad for societies. And it's bad for societies in a couple of ways. The first is more unequal societies are more fractious. And we're seeing a problem even today with social cohesion. Social cohesion's the new big issue. We like to blame social media, and absolutely that's a factor in it. But less equal societies means everybody's looking at other people and thinking they're getting ahead, they're getting a better deal. I'm upset about that. I'm feeling resentful. And people become more fractious and less cohesive. But it's also bad from an economic point of view. Even if you don't care about social cohesion, even if you're, the greatest libertarian ever and societies don't exist as far as you're concerned, inequality is bad for economic growth. We know that less equal societies grow more slowly. And that's because they don't have all of those linkages and they don't feel like they're one group, and the economy just doesn't work as well. And so what study after study has shown is that less equal societies grow more slowly than more equal societies. So even if you don't care about social cohesion, if you're only interested in the economy, if you're a hard-hearted economist and you're only interested in economic growth, then we know that more equal societies will grow faster and so grow the pie for everybody than less equal societies.
Oh, interesting. So knowing all of this, I know that, there's the superannuation tax concession changes before Parliament, but is there any more sort of political appetite to make changes to improve wealth inequality in Australia?
Well, yeah. So now we know that the housing crisis and wealth inequality are actually linked up through these investment properties. This is a great opportunity for the government to make real changes. And the real changes come about, it's hard to believe, but negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount. Really, if you reform those two, you will make investing in property, residential property, less tax effective, less attractive for people. People will think, well, I'll invest in some other area rather than investing in buying an investment property. And so what will happen then is more people will buy their own home. We will see home ownership rates begin to rise again, and wealth inequality will be reduced. So not only will we make housing, which is the biggest crisis most people are currently facing, the housing crisis, not only will it help that, but it will also make inequality better. It'll reduce inequality.
And so looking at this from a renter's perspective, I'm currently renting. The rental market is insane, I think, pretty much everywhere in Australia. Would fewer people investing in rental properties make renting more expensive?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one I get regularly. So it makes sense at one level. If we change negative gearing in the capital gains tax discount and less people want to invest in rental properties, that means there'll be less rental properties. What's that going to do to the rental market? Well, the reason that it isn't going to make it worse is because houses can be equally used as owner-occupiers or as rental properties. So imagine you go to an auction on a Saturday, right? And there are two people bidding. One who's currently renting, but they're first home buyers, so they want to buy the house so they can live in it. And the other is an investor who wants to buy it to rent it out. Now, if the owner-occupier, the first home buyer, wins it, right, then they stop being a renter. So the number of renters goes down by 1, but the number of rental properties also goes down by 1 because the investor didn't buy it. So they go down by equal amounts. Now, if the investor buys it, then sure, there's one more rental property, but that first home buyer, right, doesn't buy a home, and so they have to continue to rent. So there's also one extra renter.
Yeah.
So because houses can equally be owner-occupier or rental properties, if we suddenly saw more people buying a home so they can be owner-occupiers, then we would have less rental properties, but because we'd have more homeowners, so therefore we would have less renters. And so they change in equal amounts. So if we had policies that encouraged home ownership, that's not going to make it harder to find rental properties because it's going to reduce the number of people who are renting.
Makes sense. So if the government does end up changing these tax concessions and people stop investing in property quite so much, what else would they be potentially investing in?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the problems with the capital gains tax discount is it encourages people to buy secondhand property as an investment. And that's not a particularly useful investment because you're not really adding anything to the economy.
Yeah, when you say second-hand property, you mean they're not building new?
Yeah, they're not building new. Some people invest in brand new property, but the vast majority of investment properties when they're bought are actually properties that were built 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago or more, right? They're just basically changing hands with the property. But, if instead we stopped encouraging people to buy secondhand property, but instead encouraged them to invest in new businesses or invest in new ways of doing things. So instead of funneling their money into secondhand property, which is not actually adding to the economy, they instead funneled it into new businesses, then those new businesses could buy new equipment, become more productive, produce stuff, and grow the economy.
Create more jobs.
Exactly right. So in Australia, we've got this weird situation where we have an enormous amount of money being funneled into what is effectively just an investment that is designed to go up in value over time, but not actually add anything to the economy.
Yeah.
Whereas in other countries, their investment rules encourage investment into more productive forms of investment that will actually add to the economy. And so in economics, we talk about earned and unearned income. And what we mean by unearned income is not that, that they didn't deserve it, but it's actually a passive form of income. That is, it doesn't add anything. So if I go out and I run a business, right, I'm actively adding to the economy. If I go out and work, then I'm adding to the economy. But if I go out and just buy an asset and sit on it for, 10 years and then sell it for more than what I bought it for, that hasn't really added anything to the economy. It hasn't been as a productive an investment as if you'd gone out and actively increased the size of the economy.
So just to sum up, Matt, these sort of tax concessions that are driving people to funnel heaps of money into their super and also invest heavily in investment properties, it's not only driving the housing crisis, it's preventing people from investing in things that might add more to the economy, and it's making wealth inequality so much worse in Australia. Am I right?
Absolutely, yeah. The capital gains tax discount, it's a terrible tax policy. It only benefits really high income earners. We know that over 80% of the capital gains tax discount goes to the top 10% of income earners.
Wow, 80% to 10%.
Yeah. 10% get 80% of the benefit. There are very few things that are actually as unequal as the capital gains tax discount. And we know that if we reform it, then it will have wide-ranging effects on the whole economy. And given that the housing crisis is affecting homeowners, it's affecting renters, it's affecting people who can't find a home, it could actually improve the lives of millions and millions of Australians.
Well, it seems like pretty simple policy changes that might...
If only the government could have the political courage to actually make this change.
Yeah. Well, that's probably all we've got time for today, Matt. Thank you so much for filling in today.
Thanks for having me.
All right, well, thank you everyone for listening. We'll be back next week with Dollars and Cents, and hopefully Greg will be back on board. This episode of Dollars and Cents was recorded on the 6th of February, and some things may have changed since recording. Matt's Blue Sky handle and Twitter handle is @MattGoodenough, and I am @Elinor Johnston-Leek. Our theme music is from Blue Dot Sessions. Thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Bye.